A very good afternoon to all. I'll introduce myself. I hope we are all having a good connection and you can hear. In this age of Zoom meetings, I think we are okay. My name is Gita Hongwana Welch, and I am an associate fellow at the Chatham House for the Africa program. I'll be chairing the session. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this meeting on post-COVID recovery in Africa. This meeting is on policy for recovery in Africa, vaccine access and manufacturing. And it is part of a series on COVID-19 recovery in Africa, which is held as a partnership between the Africa program of Chatham House and the United Nations Development Program. The aim is to bring together experts, decision makers, to examine and exchange on the key challenges, potential solutions, and approaches as African countries confront the shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic. The meeting will be held in French and in English, so you should kindly use the interpretation function in the controls at the bottom of your screens. I hope everybody's familiar with that. To select your preferred language. So there'll be simultaneous translation throughout. Furthermore, I should give you a few information points of practical nature. So all the attendees will be muted during the presentations. Only the presenter will be on. But you can use the raise hand function during the Q&A sessions in order to ask questions and obviously unmute yourself to speak. If selected, you will be granted by the Africa program team the ability to do that automatically. So just raise your hand and the rest will be done for you. And I'll then, we'll ask you to take the floor. Participants may also submit written questions through the Q&A box throughout the meeting. But if you can, please use the raise hand so that you can yourself express your questions directly. Unfortunately, we are unable to take questions from participants joining us through Facebook. Facebook is on, but we cannot take those questions. So please, those on Facebook, accept our apologies. Otherwise, the meeting will be held on the record, and this means that those present may use the information provided from the meeting and quote or cite or identify speakers and other participants during the discussion. Note also that filming and recording of this event are not allowed without prior permission from Chatham House. However, you are welcome to tweet, obviously, during the event. I now have the pleasure to very briefly introduce our distinguished speakers for today. Note also that more detailed biographies can be found via the link in the chat box. So let me start with our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker for today is Dr. Michel Sidibe. He is the African Union Special Envoy for the African Medicines Agency, AMA. I know I'm not going to do any justice to the speakers in this very brief presentation, and for that, I do apologize. But the other panelists, whom I'm equally delighted to welcome, are Dr. Nikais Ndembi, Chief Science Advisor, Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and also Associate Professor of Division of Epidemiology and Prevention at the University of Maryland. We also have Dr. Amakwa Vani, who is a lecturer in law at University of Leeds and also the president of the African International Economic Law Network. We have still Mr. Alain Al-Sahani, vaccines and special projects pharmacist at Médecins Sans Frontières Access Campaign. And we also have Dr. Edem Adzogenu, Director of Afro Champions and member of the UNDP African Influencers for Development. But before we move on to the keynote address, I would very much like to invite Dr. Mandip Daliwal, Director of HIV, Health and Development Practice at the Bureau for Policy and Program of the United Nations Development Program, for your very brief opening remarks. Dr. Mandip, you have the floor.
Thank you, Gita, and it's very nice to meet you finally. You're a bit of a legend at UNDP, so it's nice to put a face to the name. Distinguished guests and speakers, it's an honor to be here today, and I think on behalf of UNDP, I have to say it's an honor to partner with Chatham House for this very important discussion. We know that the pandemic is a multidimensional development crisis that has cost more than 4.5 million lives. It has also affected livelihoods by putting the brakes on economic growth, disrupting trade, and reversing hard-won HIV, health, and development gains. The complex and far-reaching nature of the pandemic demands a coordinated global response. UNDP is pleased to be working with UN, government, civil society, and private sector partners on the development dimensions of vaccine equity. We focus on strengthening systems and governance to address the vaccine inequity challenge. In Africa alone, some 40 million people have been pushed back into poverty because of the virus. Over 100 million people who were able to afford sustainable energy before the pandemic can no longer do so, and 168 million have become food insecure. COVID-19 has placed a huge financial and socioeconomic burden on the global community, and the burden is being felt particularly hard in Africa. The global rollout of COVID vaccines is progressing at two very different and very alarmingly different speeds. Less than 2% of adults were fully vaccinated in most low-income countries, as compared to almost 50% in high-income countries. These countries, the majority of which are in Africa, simply cannot access sufficient vaccine to meet the global goal of vaccinating 40% of their populations by the end of 2021, let alone the African Union's goal of 70% in 2022. And let's remember that we missed the 10% vaccination target for September. Vaccine inequity anywhere will stall economic development everywhere. The Economic Intelligence Unit estimates that the failure to address vaccine inequity in Africa could cost the world economy 2.3 trillion over the next 4 years. That's 2.3 trillion. With the consequent losses in jobs, reduced fiscal space in national budgets, and drastically reduced capacity to fund health and education. Ironically, while economies in vaccinated countries are rebounding, African economies are not expected to return to pre-pandemic levels until after 2023. This is simply unacceptable. In the face of the vaccine famine in Africa, precipitated by the lack of access and affordability to vaccination, diagnostics, and treatments, the continent is rising, taking important and innovative steps to address vaccine inequity. And we're going to hear a lot about these initiatives today. For example, the AVAT initiative of the African Union, which plans to provide 400 million doses of the single-shot J&J COVID vaccine through the African Medical Supplies Platform over 18 months. This is made possible by a 2 billion facility provided by the African Export-Import Bank. AVAT will greatly increase the availability of life-saving vaccines across the continent while also increasing jobs and facilitating technology transfer. Ultimately, scaling and strengthening vaccine manufacturing on the continent is imperative, as is the access to know-how and technology to make the vaccines. We've been here before in the HIV pandemic, and there are many lessons that we must learn and implement now. Vaccine inequity is not inevitable. It can be a once in a generation opportunity to save lives, save livelihoods, and save the planet. It's about deliberate policy choices, innovation, sustainability, and urgent investments. And we're here today to discuss the key issues and potential solutions for African governments in urgently scaling access to vaccines, in developing manufacturing capacity and supply chains on the continent. And I can think of no better keynote speaker to lead us in this conversation. And I really would be remiss, I must pay tribute to Michel Sidibe and his incredible leadership in the global HIV response. So I know he will bring that strong experience to the vaccine inequity challenge in Africa. And I really look forward to hearing from him and all the other speakers. But thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today. Over to you, Geeta.
Thank you so much, Mandip. It is very nice to meet you also. Finally, your name carries a lot of weight in the work that UNDP is doing in these areas. But you have, in fact, started introducing our keynote speaker, and thank you for that also, Mandip. As we said before, Dr. Michel Sidibe is the Africa Union Special Envoy for the Africa Medicines Agency. He's much more than that. And basically, you know, I think I would just like to add at this point that he has formerly served as the Minister of Health and Social Affairs of Mali, and was also the second Executive Director of UNAIDS and the Secretary General of the United Nations. But please, you will see his very, very lengthy biography in many places. We have a little summary for you. It is my single pleasure and honor, Michel, to give you the floor at this point. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geeta. And let me start by saying thanks also to Mandip for his nice word. But I want to start from the outset to say thanks to Chatham House and UNDP for organizing this, I can say, timely and topical event, because this event is happening at a critical time for Africa and for the world. The COVID-19, like Mandip said, the pandemic has exposed our continent's vulnerabilities in ensuring access to vital drugs, vaccines, and health technologies. And we know a strong regulatory system is an integral part of a well-functioning health ecosystem. And the pandemic is confirming the urgent need for the African Medicine Agency, which was adopted in 2019 by African Union. African Medicine Agency will be the second continental health agency after Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Africa CDC. And that's why it's so important to have UNDP with us. We're talking about a new instrument, a governance system that will enhance regulatory oversight across the continent and meet the challenges of access to quality, safe, and efficacious medicines. The help of UNDP on accompanying and helping us to set this instrument will be key. Why we can even say that African Medicine Agency is important, is timely. The pandemic has underscored the critical gap in vaccine manufacturing in Africa as well. While Africa represents 18% of the world's population, it represents less than 0.1% of the world's vaccine production. The global rollout of a COVID-19 vaccine to date is neither inclusive nor adequately planned, like said by Mandip. On one end, those who have a vaccine, and On the other, those who are left behind. I think it's important for us to take time to think seriously about what could be the new way to build a new solidarity. Because despite the urgent need to increase vaccination rate on the continent to save thousands of lives, Africa has received far few vaccines from the global supply. Of the 7.5 billion vaccines produced globally, Africa has received only, I said, 170 million. That's just 2%. I was mentioning out of the population of 1.3 billion, just 2% of all Africans are fully vaccinated against the virus. More than 1.2 billion people have not received a single dose of vaccine. And at the current rate, much of Africa may not be vaccinated until 2023. Such a vaccine inequality is not simply unjust, given the potential for dangerous mutation that could render vaccines less effective. I think it is epidemiologically wrong. As a result, Africa may well become the COVID center of the world. Although there is an acute vaccine supply shortage in Africa, globally, vaccine production has been increasing at a secure rate. With overall production, I said overall production to be at around 1.5 billion doses per month. The issue is not one of supply, but rather one of unequal distribution. Now it is time to transfer vaccines from the vast stockpile the West is having. By December 2021, over 1.2 billion doses could be available for donation by the G7 alone. But we are not talking about charity. We are talking about moral obligation. We are talking about building the link between the North and the South, making sure that we save millions of lives. Western countries should agree to transfer their supply of unused vaccines to COVAX. Then we can ensure that the vaccine reach the places where they are needed the most. In addition, to ensure the best allocation and the quickest vaccination program, COVAX should work with African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team, which has pulled together resources to procure vaccines for its member state. I think there is no greater test of moral solidarity and of the world's ability to come together. And I repeat, it is not about charity. It is also about how we can make sure that we can produce locally in Africa and make sure that our capacity can match our next pandemic risk, because we know a delays in vaccinating the global population have an economic cost as well. Like Mandip mentioned, a recent study from the economists estimated that the sub-Saharan Africa would register the highest low size as a share of GDP, with low size totaling 3% of GDP from 2022 to 2025 due to slow vaccination rates. I want to say, furthermore, Africa accounts for 25% of the world's disease burden, but only 6% of health spending, and produce only 3% of the medicine used by its people. The African pharmaceutical sector is expected to grow from 20 billion in 2012 to 66 billion in 2022, the fastest growing market in the world. Health and wellness sector in Africa projected to be worth around 259 billion by 2030, with the potential to create over 16 million jobs, taking advantage also of the African Continental Free Trade Area. African Medicine Agency will be able to strengthen Africa research and development capacity. It's time for us to Africanize research and development. We know that, for example, malaria has been discovered 141 years ago, but we don't still have a vaccine. It will help us to harmonize the drug regulation system, help countries comply with the best practices and international standards, strengthen the fight against substandards and counterfeit medicine and medical products, and it will boost our manufacturing capacity for medicine and vaccine in the future, and create certainly an opportunity for attracting the best of our continent to work together around a platform which is could be created with and facilitated with integration of different countries in the continent. I want to stop there and say thanks for giving me opportunity to share a few words with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michel, for this very short but very inspiring, as ever, address. When we start this series of meetings in this partnership of Chatham House and UNDP, and we are focusing, as you have pointed out so well, on issues, very, very complex issues with which African governments are confronted, caused mainly by unequal distribution. But you also, in this very brief address, pointed some possible ways forward to actually, come out of this global crisis. Thank you so very much. We would like now to open the floor for some 15 minutes of a Q&A on your address from the floor. I would like to remind participants that they can ask to speak with the raise hand. They can post their comments on the chat, but we would very much see a few hands, and we would very much also take this opportunity to hear what our participants have to say. So not just questions, short comments also. I ask you to be short and concise in the interest of time also. So I'm opening the floor now for some 15 minutes of a Q&A. Indeed, it's not a question of charity, as we've just heard. This is such a today topic. This is such a preoccupation for governments, for development partners, for the UN, for all of us. Governments are grappling on how it is. The numbers, the statistics are absolutely unbelievable. How do we go forward? Please, your comments. I don't see any hands yet. I think it's the power of your speech. It's the power of your words, Michel. People are digesting. I just hope that I'm not missing. There are some written questions already, and we can address those. I can't see them. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So there are already some questions on our chat. Okay. All right, Joyce, I see you have your hand up, and Peter Sullivan, I'll give the floor to Joyce Kibet first. Please, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you can hear me. My name is Joyce from Nairobi, Kenya. I just wanted to find out whether Africa has been preemptive in terms of skills transfer, in terms of vaccine manufacturing, so as to enable sustainability of closing the gaps in this issue, because we've dealt with malaria, we've dealt with Ebola. What's the status of skills transfer of vaccine manufacturing in terms of the African capacity? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Michel, do you want to address question by question? I've got 2 other questions. It's up to you. Unmute yourself, please.
We can take series of questions, so it will
Very
be
good.
easy. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the first question, Joyce. I now give the floor to Peter Sullivan. Please pose your question, Peter. Go ahead. Hello? Peter Sullivan? Perhaps you are muted. If not, I will now go to John Radford. John Radford, please go ahead and mute yourself and pose your question or your comment.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, good. My question, which I posed a little earlier on the Q&A, is really, which is the most pressing problem that we have to address in the next few months? Is it actually the supply of vaccine, which you said was now coming up to, I think, 7.5 billion doses this year? Or is it actually something a little more complicated, such as vaccine hesitancy within the countries, or just the infrastructure required to get the vaccines into people's arms? Infrastructure in the widest sense. What is your opinion, please?
Okay, perhaps we have the 2 questions. Let me just quickly go back to see if Peter, if Peter Sullivan, do you want to ask your question? Okay, let's progress, and I'll take 1 more, and then perhaps we'll take another round. Let's go to David Sumner.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Please,
Okay, fine.
please
So,
go ahead.
2 questions. Number 1, can you confirm the severity or the importance of social acceptance of vaccine, and how much of an issue is that, or how much does that contribute towards the low vaccination rates? Number 2, do you believe that in sub-Saharan Africa, if a vaccine was studied on local populations, that would help with social acceptance? And the third question is, we currently have a vaccine in development. Are there any hospitals or medical institutions that are currently conducting phase 1 clinical studies, i.e. first in human studies?
Thank you, David. I'll just add, I think, the last speaker that we have, and then you can respond to all of them. For now, it's Austin Davies. Can Austin please take the floor as the last question for this round?
Can you hear me?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's been very encouraging to see strong voices from leaders in the African Union, in NEPAD, in AVAT, in the ACDC, calling for African investment in science, African investment in local production. We've also seen MasterCard putting up a significant bid to support technology transfer. And we've seen some of the donors like the EU and US standing up to invest over €1 billion in local production. What I'm not so aware of, and I think all of these things will fail unless there is strong domestic political support and an acknowledgement of the need to build the regulatory frameworks, the research, and the production capacity. So we haven't seen any strong statements coming out of the national leaderships around how they're going to go about doing this. So maybe Michel knows a lot more about the current discussions in the member states of how they will support this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Michel, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think a series of questions probably will be addressed by Nikes Dembi later on. But let me pick the questions which has been mentioned. First one, I think the strong question around the regulatory system is key. With a fragmented approach, without a strong regulatory body, we will not have a well-functioning health ecosystem. And today, the continent decided, and I can tell you, I travel on 18 countries, met 17 presidents, push all the regulatory bodies to be sure that they can ratify the treaty for creating African Medicine Agency. If we were having African Medicine Agency, we could have a framework which could have helped us even to deal with the question of social acceptance, deal with the question of hesitancy, because most of those issues came also when we realized that developed world were not even clear on which vaccine should be given to people, which vaccine we need to inoculate. AstraZeneca is good or not, Sinopharm or not. So we took a lot of time, and which created a lot of problems for our people. So I don't think it's because people want to reject vaccine. If you look at in the world, almost 25% of the world vaccine are inoculated in Africa. So people have certainly already a model how to distribute, how to inoculate vaccine, how to make sure that it could reach people. But in this case, we have to know that we were faced by a production failure. COVAX could not receive a necessary vaccine to be able to supply that to African countries on time, because the main supplier was India Institute. But when India faced the big challenge of course, Delta, India became a net importer after being a net exporter of vaccine. So it's showing clearly that we need also to be able to have the first question and hub of excellencies in Africa to start producing vaccine by building a partnership. But that also need a strong regulatory mechanism, pharmacovigilance, bioequivalence. You are talking about if we could have a study on local population with a trial which are clear, which are not creating any a problem to the people, so they don't feel that it is something which is imposed to them. So I personally feel that taking all the question, one of the central issue will be to put in place quickly the African Medicine Agency, like African Union started to push, because I personally feel it will make a big difference in terms of mutualizing of course, competencies, but in terms of also research and development platform, in terms of protecting our market, because you have to know today, almost some countries is 40% of substandard drugs and fake drugs. So we need a strong regulatory body. I want to just stop there and say that those are few points, a very important one. And I hope I touched to those issues by summarizing a little bit my intervention.
Thank you very much, Michel. Let us now move swiftly, and in doing that, reminding all of those who might have wanted to pose questions now, that we are not going to go to a second round. We are going to go straight to Dr. Nikes Ndembi, who unfortunately cannot stay with us for the whole length of the meeting. So we very much want to hear Dr. Ndembi, exactly. We very much want to hear what this discussant has to say. And without much ado, I will give you the floor. Please go ahead. I see that you have a presentation also on the screen. Please go ahead with your presentation.
No, thanks so much, Madam Chair. First, I would like really to commend Dr. Michel Sidibe really for the great effort that he has been doing. We are really proud of him. He's a champion. As an AU voice, I think we've seen what AMA is really the leadership that he's putting into. So it's commendable. I just want to start there because, as you mentioned, the topic on vaccine manufacturing, we cannot do that without regulatory. It's impossible because from the proof of concept, clinical trials, up to the product and even the vaccine delivery, you need regulatory processes. So as we speak, only 2 African countries have received maturity level 3. That's why the work is doing is really critical in moving us forward in terms of having or building a resilient healthcare system. So I think I wanted to really start with that so that we set really the stage for that. So where are we? I've heard numbers around, but let me just put it into perspective. As of September 27, 142 million doses have been delivered. We started around March 2021. 85 million individuals have received at least a first dose, and then 56 million at least fully vaccinated from 53 countries. I think it's already a flag. We're flagging already that we're 55, but there are still countries that have not really started administering vaccines. That's already one layer of inequity that we need to look into. The map by your right will provide you the number of doses. The more actually, if you look at it, the greener one there, at least Morocco, South Africa, and some of other countries that you've seen, they have at least have over 10 million people vaccinated. That's still low. So this inequity is more prominent on this slide. You can see the rest of the world. They have administered over, let's put it, be conservative, 78 per 100 people. So almost vaccinated, they have almost reached our target. If we were in Africa, that's our target at the African Union. And then Africa, we see those that receive first and second dose, even those that are fully vaccinated, we're still at 10%. So only 4.2% of the world vaccines have been administered in Africa. This is unacceptable. And we represent over 17% of the world population. I think you see that really inequity now, really with the numbers. So now vaccine acquisition, I think the special envoy mentioned about that acquisition. We actually, Africa, we really took that bold step at the African Union to really secure vaccine. If we're waiting for the rest of the world, I'm sure we wouldn't have been where we are. We've actually secured $2 billion, over 400 million doses of the J&J vaccines that are currently being rolled out. I think we've received less than 20% from the international community. So the vaccine acquisition, about 185 doses have been supplied, and then 142 doses administered. I think it's not too bad. It means that you can look at it, for those who are asking, is it a problem of vaccines or a problem of administration? Give us the vaccines, we're going to deliver. So if you look at it, it's not too bad. We have the vaccines, we have administered over 80% of those vaccines. in about 53 member states. So those are doing very well, population vaccinated. We have Morocco, 51%, Mauritius, over 61%, and the Seychelles are vaccinated more than double the target that African Union set for that. I think that's also our champions for really vaccination, COVID-19 vaccination. So what is our vision? We have learned our lessons from COVID-19. I think we think we need to build a sustainable and reliable vaccine development manufacturing ecosystem. And that has started. The train has left the station. I'm going to tell you why. So now the numbers also, the special envoy mentioned that 99% of our vaccines are being imported. Again, this is unacceptable for our health security. Only 1% produced locally. Our projection from the African Union is that by 2040, we should be able to produce 60% on the continent. We can do it. It's possible, and we've started actually looking into that. It's clear we need a framework. He who fails to plan is planning to fail. We are planning. I think we'll get there. So I think those who have stated this, the leadership of the continent is fully supportive. There's a strong political backing among this. I can't recall how many times the head of state have met around COVID-19 or discussing vaccines, or the head of state meeting, the special envoy has mentioned around these issues. I think we have a strong political commitment from the AU leadership. So we set up what we call the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing. That was launched by President Etienne Tshisekedi. We've seen President Kagame during our summit organized by African Union saying vaccine equity cannot be guaranteed by goodwill alone. What do we need from the leadership? They have said it all. If you want quote from all the 55 member state leadership, we can do that to show that there's a strong political commitment. So this is our roadmap, very simple, straightforward to get to 2040. I think we've started it, and then we're going to get there. We had a summit, which have over 40,000 participants in 100 countries attended. It shows you the significance, how Africans, we really want to take the leadership on this. Having African solution to Africa problem, not only Africa problem, even global problem. We should be able to be the powerhouse for vaccine manufacturing, probably like India, for the rest of the world. We've set up the PALM task force. We're going to come up with framework for action, a continental strategy, engage with member states. We already have countries that have achieved maturity level 3 and moving to maturity level 4. Strengthen our national regulatory authorities. I think we'll get there. They are pharmaceutical company. Again, this is the structure and the governance of what I've called the PAVM, the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing. You can see there, we have a plan. There's a market design and demand intelligence, the regulatory strengthening led by AUD and NEPAD, access to finance. We look at all the big financing on the continent to self-sustain and fund it for sustainability, technology and IP transfer, RNA research and development and hubs. We just returned from South Africa where we set up a mRNA hubs supported by WHO, Africa CDC and other partners. We're already starting, the movement is there. And then we plan to establish 5 across the 5 regions of the African Union, and then infrastructure development. So I'm going to skip this slide because these are the mandates of the PAVM. I've shared the slide, we can actually have that. But this is the most important slide that I want to show. These are the countries that I say we really want to go and get this vaccine manufacturing done. I think those are also champion in terms of that. Why? Because they felt we need, and we have resources for that on the continent. That will involve Egypt, Ethiopia, Senegal, South Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, Ghana, Morocco, Nigeria, Rwanda, Uganda, Angola, Botswana, Kenya, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Cote d'Ivoire. You see, we have over 17 countries that have expressed an interest for vaccine manufacturing. We're not staying behind. We're not staying hand-folded. We really want to take that and the momentum going. So for the next 2 slides, this is the continental strategy. And the scope really, as I mentioned, to really have a streamlined ecosystem. We do not want to move in a fragmented way. Very coordinated, as we did for Harvard, getting the vaccines to our people, getting more vaccines that will be able to reach our target. And the purpose is really to achieve national ambitions. We just ended the call with Ghana an hour ago. They have a very good vaccine strategy. They have mobilized resources and partners for IP transfer and technology. I think, and then they have the strong backing from the head of state and the African Union and other stakeholders. I think it's doable. So the impact, we're going to identify the ecosystem requirement and work closely with donors, partners to be able to sustain that ecosystem. So this is what we're looking at. at least not only COVID. We don't want to build stadium that after COVID, we just shut down the stadium. No, we're looking into at least a spectrum of diseases across the continent, including diphtheria, hepatitis, measles, typhoid, meningitis. So all this will require specific technology focus. And we're also diversifying. The mRNA platform has shown to be very efficient, but we don't want to all put our eggs in one basket. We're looking at different other platforms for malaria, TB, and other infectious diseases. Fill and finish, drug substance. We've seen Rwanda coming strongly and other countries like Kenya and Uganda to look into drug substance. That's key component in the R&D and also the fill and finish that we're looking into. So this is kind of landscape. We started looking at 50 infectious diseases considered on the continent. Then we shortlisted about 29, and then we have 22 priority diseases, and we start with about 10 to be sure that we get it done. Thank you, and back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for this. So many possibilities that you're pointing out with so much positivity. We'll get there. We can do it. I think that is and also having roadmaps for that. I think that is the kind of messages that we need to take with us forward to the next events and to our places of work and so on and so forth. But it is the how that speakers are bringing to their interventions that it's also important. So thank you very much for that. I hope you can stay with us for a bit more, but I would now proceed before we open another space for Q&A to have our remaining three panelists to do their brief presentations of about 6 to 7 minutes each. Sorry about that. But we are very, very much interested in hearing what you have to say. Next, I would give the floor to Dr. Amaka Vani, who is going to focus, I think, among other things, on issues of the intellectual property rights and vaccine manufacturing in Africa, another very important topic. So please, Dr. Amaka, go ahead with your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for this opportunity and for having me. So my brief presentation will focus on intellectual property rights and vaccine manufacturing in Africa. I did not prepare a slide because I wanted my presentation to be conversational. So for this discussion, I'll be focusing on two main topics. The first one will look at mapping the IP landscape within Africa to understand Pan-African approach to intellectual property. And then the second point will then focus on the implication this has for vaccine access and manufacturing within the continent. So before I get into discussing IP within the continent, I would like to mention first that intellectual property rights are not scientifically derived, right? But instead, they are culturally constructed and negotiated between the state and private interests. And so in crafting and developing IP policy for the continent, which currently is fragmented, socioeconomic realities and needs of the continent must be placed at the center of these discussions. This includes need on food and food security concern, our strong traditional knowledge and cultural expressions, indigenous low-cost technology in informal sectors such as agriculture, emerging digital landscape, and also our entertainment and health sectors. So as I mentioned, currently the IP architecture within the continent is fragmented, comprising an array of partially overlapping and sometimes conflicting agreements, laws, policies amongst different sub-regional organizations. Let's take the African Union as an example. The AU does not have a specific IP policy for the continent, perhaps because of the presence of not one, but two IP organizations within Africa. So you have ARIPO and you have OAPI, which is the French equivalent. And also perhaps because various members of the AU have ratified TRIPS and must maintain IP laws that are TRIPS consistent. However, the AU has created policies that are related to IP, and it has also made statements that gives an indication of its potential IP policies. The strategy that is most pertinent to IP is the Science, Technology, Innovation Strategy for Africa, the STISA 2024, which places science, technology, innovation as one of the key pillars for Africa's economic development and growth. It is focused on 6 main priorities and prevention and control of diseases, as well as wealth creation and achieving, food and hunger security are just some of the examples of this, the key focus of the STISA. While the STISA seems to adopt a Western approach to IP, it also acknowledges African traditional medicinal knowledge, which I believe is a step in the right direction. This is because increased pharmaceutical industrialization within the continent requires creative engagements, particularly with actors outside your stereotypical frame of pharmaceutical innovation, such as your local herbalists and your local medicinal doctors. These are the people that create products that could qualify for patent protection, even though they operate outside of research institutions or the prototypical laboratory or factory. Such an approach could enable efficient engagement of often missed scientific artifacts and practices into inaccurate innovation record. So for instance, when you talk about innovation in Africa, right? Innovation and the development of traditional medicinal products are usually not included. And this is one of the areas where Africa has strong suits. Importantly, documenting these trends, especially within the traditional medicinal sector, could help shape continent-wide initiatives and policies aimed at accelerating local industrialization. In fact, Section 2.2 of the STIA document states that an objective is to protect knowledge production, including inventions and indigenous knowledge, by strengthening intellectual property rights and regulatory regimes at all levels. So it is good to see that at regional levels, there are initiatives recognizing the value in our indigenous traditional medicines. And as an aside, this particular recognition of inventions and indigenous knowledge is quite distinct from the TRIPS agreements, which makes no reference to traditional knowledge. One of the initiatives of the AU was to adopt an instrument establishing the Pan-African IP organization. Right now, the PIPO, as the short form is known, hasn't fully concretized because it has not been ratified and it hasn't come into force. I think out of the AU members, I think only 6 or so, I'm not really sure of the numbers, that have signed onto the PIPO. One of the things I feel this COVID pandemic, which is in some might argue is a blessing in disguise, it has brought to the forefront the importance of intellectual property, especially continent-wide approach, right? Or a unified voice on IP, so that barriers, IP created or IP influenced barriers with regards to access to medicines can be tackled using one voice. So this brings me to my second point. What is the implication for this for vaccine access and manufacturing within the continent? I think one of the first issues I would like us to be clear about is Africa's experience with regards to intellectual property, particularly TRIPS agreements, which is the foremost global international agreement on intellectual property, is not nascent as is usually assumed, right? There is a general assumption that there is capacity limitation to use TRIPS flexibilities within Africa, which is simply not true. Various countries within the continent have used TRIPS flexibilities to increase access to various medicines, include HRV medicines. Further, the Doha Declaration, which has which is a build-up or rather an expansion of the TRIPS flexibilities, has provided much needed clarification on the legal rights of the WTO members to use this flexibility. As I mentioned earlier, within the continent, there are numerous successful uses of compulsory licenses or even public non-commercial use of IP licenses. These instances might not be as popular as the Brazilian and Thai cases, but they are very much important. So for instance, in 2005, the Ghanaian Minister of Health issued a government-use compulsory licenses for importation into Ghana of generic Indian generic HIV/AIDS medicines. And so we can see that Africa, we do have experiences on employing intellectual property rules to improve access to medicines. Which brings me to the TRIPS waiver, right? As other panelists have mentioned, the TRIPS waiver put forward by India and South Africa, which as the last time I checked, had over 60 co-sponsors and over 100 members of the WTO supporting it, allows countries to temporarily suspend certain provisions, certain IP provisions, including copyrights, patents, trade secrets, and whatnot, in order to improve or scale up manufacturing and access to COVID vaccines. So this means that countries will not be required to provide any form of IP protection on all COVID-related therapeutics, medicines, or technology for 3 years. Suspending IP restrictions around COVID-related vaccines and diagnostics would provide countries the space without fear of retaliations from developed countries to collaborate with competent developers in the research and manufacturing and development of COVID-19 medicines. Currently, as we all know, the waiver is being opposed by a handful of countries, including the UK, the EU, and Switzerland. We need the TRIPS waiver because not only does it have immense ability to mobilize people, but also to tackle inequity in the global distribution of COVID vaccines, whereby wealthy countries currently control the lion's share of existing supplies. It will also lead to technology transfer, collaboration between various parties and actors, and this will see a large upscale of manufacturing of COVID vaccines. Just as how TRIPS flexibilities were invoked to increase access to COVID vaccine and to HIV medicines, I believe African countries will efficiently use the waiver to jointly procure either as a regional bloc COVID vaccines or even as single individual countries. In fact, at this point, I would like to mention the effective leadership of the African Union and Africa CDC in this regard. The African Union is now shipping Johnson & Johnson vaccine to the continent. This specific COVID vaccine, as we've just learned, was acquired under the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust. And it is the first time that AU members have collectively purchased vaccines. My final point I would like to make is that one of the key lessons that this pandemic has taught us is that availability of vaccines does not translate to access for all, even in the most direst situations. This pandemic, if anything, has taught us about the need to democratize pharmaceutical manufacturing. For so long, developed countries have ignored their obligations under the TRIPS agreement on technological transfer. And even when the technology has been transferred via voluntary agreements, undisclosed licensing terms covering patents and other IP rights typically restrict how this transferred technology can be used, the extent and the destination of these products under these agreements. So with this regard, Africa, as my panelist mentioned, only produces 1% of the vaccine it administers. The remaining 99% are imported. But to boost manufacturing from 1% to 60%, the continent needs financing amounting to millions of dollars. It needs expanded research capacity, commitment from government to purchase vaccines, and regulatory bodies that meet international standards. Currently, within the continent, there are 4 vaccine manufacturers. You have the Pasteur Institute in Dakar, in Tunis, in Algeria, and then BioVac in Cape Town, South Africa. These companies have the capacity to manufacture the substances that the vaccine is made of. There is also very limited upstream production with regards to local companies only engaging in packaging and labeling, and occasionally the fill and finish. As a result, you can see that the continent has limited capacity to repurpose facilities for large-scale manufacturing. Currently, Aspen Pharmaceuticals, again, thanks to the licensing agreement with Johnson & Johnson, is currently expected to produce 350 million doses of vaccines annually. Unfortunately, half of these products are reserved for exports back to rich countries. I would like to end on a positive note, right? As the previous speaker just mentioned, the AU launched the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing a couple of months ago. And then I think over the summer, the WHO, Afrivan, BioVac, and the Africa CDC signed a letter of intent to establish the first COVID-19 mRNA vaccine technology transfer hub in South Africa. These partnerships, right, aimed at boosting vaccine manufacturing within the continent. I would like to mention
Dr. Ramaka, if you could wrap up. Sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
That's fine. One of the things I would like to mention or conclude is to note that these partnerships are important, but then we need to create a market for the purchase of these vaccines. As it stands, most African countries are supplied with vaccines by UNICEF or Gavi or other donor actors or agencies. One of the reasons why public-private partnership for COVID vaccine was successful, as we saw in this pandemic, is because of advanced purchase agreement by various states, which allowed companies to know that once they manufacture the vaccine, there is a market for it. And so within Africa, for these kind of partnerships to be successful, we need to create an enabling environment whereby once these vaccines are manufactured, right, because we need to talk about the economic part of such partnerships, there is market for these vaccines to be purchased and used. And so that is the current situation. Of course, I would like to expand further on this during the Q&A segment. Yes. So if you have any questions, just put it in the chat. Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful, Dr. Ramaka. Thank you very, very much. Very interesting. And I think what you just said leads very nicely to the next speaker, Mr. Alain Al-Sahani, who is actually going to also focus on the scaling up manufacturing technologies. So please go ahead. You have the floor, Mr. Al-Sahani.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I'm going to try to present the campaign that the MSF Access campaign launched at the beginning of this month for Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna to share their technology with the established hub for mRNA tech transfer in South Africa. I think, as it was explained by a number of speakers now, there is clearly a problem in the equity of distribution of doses, and I mean the numbers are not up to date anymore, because this is from end of August, right? So we're at around 7 billion doses now. And when you look actually at the map, there is a pretty clear relationship between geographical zones where you have, a well-established vaccine production capacity, and where populations were vaccinated in priority. And unfortunately, as it was mentioned, the African continent is, one of the regions with the smallest number of vaccine production capacity, this is also clear, from the numbers that we've seen. The reason for that, for us to focus on the mRNA technology in particular, is because it is really a game changer. So if you look at how vaccines are produced, usually the technology is based on cell, it's a cell-based technology, and this is true for all the platforms that we see today with the COVID vaccines, except for the mRNA. And despite the fact that the mRNA is a new technology, it is actually, when you look into the details of this technology, it is one of the most adapted for production in places where you don't have the infrastructure to produce vaccines with the traditional technologies. It's not to say that with the mRNA technology, you can solve all the problems. You still need, obviously, the other platforms to produce, for instance, the childhood vaccines. But the mRNA technology might be better adapted to certain infectious diseases, so COVID, obviously, but also other infectious diseases. And we've already heard that some of the companies that have approved mRNA vaccines are started working on mRNA-based vaccines for other infectious diseases. So the mRNA vaccines are also one of the most efficacious and safe among the COVID vaccines. And these vaccines are much simpler and faster to actually produce. So if you look, for instance, at the manufacturing process, the manufacturing cycle, and what it requires, it is much simpler than the traditional vaccine production platforms. And it is something, as I said, that could be used for other infectious diseases. To substantiate this, we did actually two series of research. So we did research based on the real world data that we've seen. So all the tech transfers that happened, for instance, between Moderna and Pfizer and their contract manufacturers in Europe and in the US. So we looked at the timelines, we looked at the profiles of the companies that received the technology, but we also worked with the Imperial College of London that had its own vaccine candidate, and we try to actually put a number on and a footprint on how much it would cost to have an mRNA vaccine production. So this is a very schematic way of looking at the pharmaceutical manufacturing complexity, and I'll explain why it's important. So basically, what our research determined is that you don't need to be a vaccine manufacturer or biologics manufacturer to be able actually to produce the mRNA vaccine. And this is very important when you look at the overall, the global pharmaceutical manufacturing landscape, because basically, if you set as a quality assurance standard the good manufacturing practices as defined by the WHO, and you look around. I spent, for instance, 2 years working for MSF sourcing medicines for MSF operation in India. You'll find a considerable number of quality assured manufacturers for oral medicines. When you move up to injectable medicines, the numbers go down, and you move up to biologics and vaccines, you have even less manufacturers, right? And the same thing could be said basically about any region of the world. So the fact that the mRNA vaccine could potentially be produced by injectable medicines manufacturers, and I want to just emphasize the fact that I'm not talking here about fill finishing. I'm really talking about the production of the actual drug substance. So the actual vaccine. If the mRNA can be produced by injectable medicines manufacturers, you increase the possibilities. Basically, you increase the manufacturing base. And to give you a real world example, a company that is producing currently the drug substance for Moderna in Spain called Rovi is a manufacturer that has never produced any biologics, let alone vaccines. They do produce injectable medicines, and they actually use their existing facilities to integrate the production of the Moderna drug substance. And these are some numbers of the study that we've done with the Imperial College of London. All this is available on our website, and I'm happy to share the links with you. So we try to put a cost basically on how much it would cost to set up a production capacity in an existing facility that is currently producing injectable medicines for the two approved mRNA vaccines. So for the Pfizer vaccine on the right, and this is the Moderna vaccine. So you can see the numbers. I mean, yes, it might be, it might seem impressive, but when we are thinking about setting up a production and producing 100 million doses a year, these numbers actually are not that high. And when you look at the footprint, and that's another huge advantage of the mRNA production, is that you can produce actually a lot of doses in a relatively small footprint, which means that you can actually integrate the production in an existing facility instead of trying to build a new facility, which takes much more time, obviously. So what we are calling for is for Pfizer and BioNTech to share the technology. And when we're talking about sharing the technology, we're talking about a full tech transfer. This is not just about sharing the recipe or sharing, you know, some materials. It's about really the companies being completely involved, because this is the only way for the tech transfer, one, to be successful, and two, also to happen in the shortest possible timelines. And the WHO, the fact that the WHO set up this hub in South Africa is, well, precisely the kind of places that is needed for manufacturers that might not have this kind of, you know, expertise to come to get the necessary training, and the WHO would facilitate as well the tech transfer. Because something we've been hearing times and again from, you know, from these companies is that they don't have time, they're not interested. Well, great, if you're not interested, you just share, you know, everything with the hub, and the hub is going to take care of the tech transfer. We've actually identified, so I mean, people mentioned here some of the existing capacity in Africa. Everybody knows about the yellow fever vaccine in Dakar. The BioVac is going to be producing the hexavalent vaccine and the PCV as well. And we know also there is some capacity from Vaxira in Egypt. But actually, these are pretty limited. And we know from, for instance, from Institut Pasteur Dakar that their plan is to build a new facility, and that's great. It's great that, you know, this cell-based production is going to happen, but this is more mid and long term. If we want something to happen, you know, in the short term, the only way to do it is to use the existing facilities. And actually, when you look at the injectable medicines manufacturers, we did identify 7 of them in 4 different countries. And again, these are mentioned in our, you know, documentation. You can have a look. And what we looked at is manufacturers producing currently injectable medicines and who have good manufacturing practices certificates from stringent regulatory authorities. This is why the number might be a bit low, but these 7 manufacturers could potentially actually, you know, start producing mRNA in their current facilities should the tech transfer happen. This is a slide I borrowed from the WHO, and it was presented at the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force. So just to show you the difference in the timelines between receiving a late stage technology, so technology like the Pfizer or Moderna one, where basically everything has been done, right? So the process, you know, has been finished. You have a regulatory approval, so it's really just about transferring the technology, mastering it at the hub level, and then starting to transfer it to eligible manufacturers. While if you get an early stage technology, so anything that is at phase 1 or 2, you have to go through the whole development process all over, right? Again, and this will take much more time. Unfortunately, until now, the WHO has not received any technology at all, so you know, late or early stage. And the latest I know about is that the decision was made to start actually developing an mRNA vaccine from scratch. This is really unfortunate. It's very commendable that the WHO is going through this effort, and it has its own obviously positive effects, but the fact that, you know, we have 2 approved mRNA vaccines and also quite advanced candidate vaccines in the pipeline, and that, you know, all we can do is to go back and, you know, start everything from scratch, it's really regrettable. So our campaign is really focusing on 2 objectives. There is obviously the current supply, and I mean, I agree with people who said the supply is not the major problem with COVID-19 vaccines, especially when we look at the projections for, you know, this year and next year. But I think the investment in this technology should also be seen as something for the future. And as I said, so future pandemics, if COVID remains with us as a, you know, an endemic disease that will require at least vaccinated certain population, but also, you know, using it for other infectious diseases. It's a platform, right? It's not just about the vaccine. It's about getting a platform that opens the door for you know, many different infectious diseases potentially, and a lot of R&D activity that could happen on the African continent. Our specific objective is obviously to see production happening on the continent for all the reasons that we've mentioned, you know, I think as a group today. But I think if the production also happens somewhere else in the global south, that will still be a victory. We are targeting, as I said, the 2 companies with approved vaccines, just because we think this is the fastest way of doing it. We're obviously not closing the door to any other company that has an mRNA candidate to join the the hub. I think anything that is more advanced than starting from scratch is already something positive, and we're trying to pressure as much as possible governments who funded for funded these companies for R&D. It's the case for BioNTech. It's the case for Moderna, for them to basically share the technology with the hub. So these are the links. I will share them. I don't know via chat. I guess you receive copies of this presentation. I really invite you to go through the documentation. There is a briefer that is quite short and quite I think reader friendly, and we have also a longer report. So that's the report that we worked on with the Imperial College of London for those of you who want to get into more detail on the technical side. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Alain, for that very practical presentation. And I would like now to give the floor to Dr. Edem Azugenu. Please, Dr. Edem, go ahead with your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. And I also want to hark on the very, very elaborate and very insightful presentations that have been made to say that the issue is really not about having capacity, or the issue is not about having the desire. There's clear value in the fact that there's a lot of contribution that within the vaccine manufacturing space, different ecosystems, either within the continent from the policy side or from the capability side, are contributing globally, whether it's to the manufacturing companies or whether it's at various levels of the political order within the global health order. So I'm also very thankful to Chatham House and UNDP for this opportunity to at least speak to what we are doing, particularly to sort of fill in some of the gaps that we believe on the continent can create value. I think one of the clear things for us is that we have to also look at where exactly do we think from a comparative advantage standpoint Africa can bring value. And by just looking at the whole various value chains of the vaccine process, manufacturing or the drug manufacturing process, there's the design phase, which particularly with respect to vaccine, we're talking about $1 billion of investment required with 5 to 10 years of preparation. And then the substance production phase, which is also about another $1 billion. And then the fill and finish side, which a lot of countries are currently sort of pursuing. We're talking about, depending on the number of doses, 100 million doses could go for about $250 million US dollars. And so these for us are opportunities within the pharmaceutical space, given that we already know the statistics of how much of the $50 billion of demand for vaccines, $1.2 trillion of the entire pharmaceutical space expected to go to 1.5 trillion by 2025. So Africa's regional market, taking advantage of the continental free trade area, positions us, once we have a lot of the negotiations in terms of all the pharma value chains and the tariff regulations that go with it sorted, we could be looking at really going up to $28 billion of market, which could keep growing. So there has to be some convergence, and I know Dr. Sidibe has spoken very much about that, but we are trying to see how we don't end up going into fill and finish and many other things, but we still end up importing a lot of the intermediate products that we need for those manufacturing within the continent. And so, currently, even for most of the drugs that we produce, even for analgesics, 80 to 90% of the intermediate products we need for manufacturing are imported. And if the price of those intermediate products go high, it's going to affect the price of our production, and people end up still having to import. So a lot of the structural issues, that need to be dealt with, particularly within mapping out the ecosystem around the design of the intermediate products, is one of the areas that we've currently focused. I mean, if you look at vaccine, for example, the amount of IT work that needs to be done, protein folding, excipients, these are all things that various ecosystems within the continent has capacity to produce, but without focusing on them and spreading the surface area to ensure that they can contribute what they are doing to the entire value chain, we'll end up not even recognizing they exist on the continent and keep importing a lot of those intermediate products. So that's one area, designing and mapping out the ecosystem of the intermediate value chain, understanding who is doing what already, and how do we make sure that that fits into the big vision that the AU, the Africa CDC, African Medicines, AMA, and others have. Then there's the other aspect which has to do with the gateway for auxiliary services, around financing and also tech transfer. I think that's also another area that requires a lot of work by getting our governments to create the kind of incentives that will enable investments to come in, looking at each country's comparative advantage, whether it's tax exemption, whether it's being able to use corporate taxes, among others, to ensure that finances can come in so that a lot of these projects don't have to be too capital intensive, but can attract the kind of investment. Given that there are so many countries on the continent that want to go into this production, and we're looking at, it's a matter of demand. And when it comes to matters of vaccines, you're really talking about not the kind of standard procurements that go through just the regular, private sector pharmacies, but these are actually going through huge procurements through governments, through international organizations, through donor institutions. A lot of the offtake has to be sorted out before we can even begin to look at, the capacity. So I think that's another area where making sure that the various countries have comparative advantage in terms of where their competence and expertise lie within the value chains is going to be important. So you don't have a situation where many countries have capacity to produce, but they are not able to produce enough to meet economies of scale. So that kind of regulatory process, that requires a lot of civil service reforms than we currently have. It's where a lot of our research work and also a lot of our consultations currently are taking place. And then there's also the understanding of the existing, digital space, the tech space. There's a lot of work that within the digital space currently on the continent, young startups are doing. I mean, we've all seen how today Moderna and BioNTech are examples of how startups have moved very quickly into producing vaccines, even ahead of the big, multinational companies that we are used to knowing, because the technology keeps improving and because the innovation keeps improving. And understanding that whole digital space for us is also extremely important, because that's where a lot of the revolutionary and the game changing takes place. And mapping out who is doing what in that space is also extremely very important. And that's part of the work we're doing currently. We think that if we do our work well, what we're doing currently is what we're describing as the 4D, because continent is very fragmented. There's a lot happening that we don't even realize. There's a lot of policy work going on, but those who are supposed to be implementers of that policy normally are not involved and find the policy sometimes inimical to their interest. So the 4D initiative that we're working with the African Union on currently is looking at how we combine the legitimacy that the African Union, the African governments bring, the policy legitimacy that they bring to harmonize around those who really just have the capacity to be entrepreneurial, to take risks, which are in the private sector, working more closely hand in hand in the civil society on platforms that enable us financiers to be able to invest without necessarily seeing risk. And that kind of ecosystem is unique in the sense because it doesn't exist currently. I mean, it's different countries trying to do their own thing, the regional bodies doing their thing, and private sector also doing their thing. But creating that ecosystem that allows the public, private, civil society all working together harmoniously around platforms where we're sharing information, sharing data, is what we're calling 4D, and which we believe that will help accelerate production. And it doesn't have to be waiting to have the huge production, but having aggregates of productive capacity that exists by using digitalization, whilst waiting for the huge infrastructure for rail, transport, for logistics to take place, by using digitalization to really amass a lot of ecosystems that exist with the knowledge, with the know-how and the innovation to drive manufacturing capacity in that regard. And finally, because there's a model that we've already experimented already, where we're taking trusted travel and trusted vaccines, working very closely with Africa CDC. Afro Champions have been able to now integrate over 13 to 15 countries where test data, travel data, vaccine data, we're able to combine all of that and being able to now help manufacturers on how we're able to produce boosters for specific variants as they move across the continent. And now that we are also combining genomic data, we think that some of this information can be extremely very powerful in supporting the work that the manufacturers are doing. And so for us, it's really about digitizing the whole supply chain ecosystem and making it possible for manufacturers to know where to source investments to and make it very productive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edem, for that very comprehensive presentation. I would like now, because we are also running out of time, to take 3 questions that were posed on the chat during these presentations. And I'm not so sure that we will have time for more after the responses to these. So I would very quickly move to that. The first one is a question from Franz Schmigel, probably mostly from Amaka, but I think other panelists should feel free to respond. The second one is from Trudy Hilton, and there is a third one, and I think this is the last one we have, which is from Jessica Hammer. I'm just going to ask that whoever answers from the panel be also very concise and brief. And don't forget, these conversations continue. And also, we are going to have products after each one of these webinars where further information can be exchanged and so on and so forth. So for the first of the last 3 questions, Franz, I don't know if you would like to pose your question very quickly, directly. If not, I'll just go ahead and read it. Perhaps it's easier and quicker. The question is as follows for Amaka, I think. If the TRIPS waiver for COVID-19 vaccines would be accepted, how could the technology transfer be done, financed, and in which countries are their production capacities? So that is one question. Let me read the other 2 questions because they might be related. Please take note, Amaka and other panelists who may want to respond very quickly. Second question from Trudy Hilton. Many countries in Africa lack cold chain infrastructures to manage insulin. Therefore, how can vaccines reach remote areas effectively? I think this was also part of the conversation. Third, and last, from Jessica Hammer, to build up capacity on manufacturing, what needs to happen to get originator companies to engage more on technology transfer? What incentives could bring more companies to the table on this, and what other actions might be needed? So please, Amaka, do you want to start with a very short, concise response to leave space for other panelists if they want to come in? Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. With regards to question from Franz, what could be done to ensure tech transfer and the finance? Well, there are various models right now in place with regards to tech transfer for COVID vaccines. So Butantan Institute in Brazil is in a tech transfer agreement with Sinopharm in China. So what the particular agreement, what it does is Sinopharm sent the technology to Butantan, and then Butantan then conducted a very large 3rd phase clinical trial on the vaccine, and then shared that data with Sinopharm. So there was not really a money exchange based on the interview I conducted with the party with Butantan. However, the exchange of data, which is really, really important for vaccine development, and most times ignored when we talk about tech transfer, is really crucial in developing capacity. So in the case of Africa, there is what could happen is a similar case where the technology is transferred to capable manufacturers within the continent. And then what those manufacturers could do is then share the data with regards to the clinical trials they will conduct when that particular vaccine is produced within the continent. So there will be an exchange of data and technology. That is one way this can happen, and one way to encourage tech transfer. To answer Jessica's questions, what incentives could bring companies to the table? Again, clinical trial data. Data when it comes to vaccine manufacturing is very, very important. It's part of what is known as trade secrets, right? It's part of what is known as undisclosed information. These are all IP rights. So it could be access to data that could lure these companies to the table. Another factor, another example that could lure them is to bring in the law, right? If you look at the TRIPS agreement, Article 7 and 8 mandates that there should be transfer and dissemination of technology to encourage industrialization and growth within WTO members. So if the carrot of exchange of trial data between parties don't work, we can bring in the sticks, right, of bringing in the law to ensure that while we are sticking to other aspects of TRIPS, such as patent protection for 20 years, protection of trade secrets and clinical trial data, we also bring in the fact that companies and states are mandated by international law to share and encourage dissemination of technology among members. I hope this answers the question, but please feel free to send me email if you need more clarification. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that clarification. I'm not sure if all the questions were answered, but I would like very quickly to ask our panelists if they have a 1 minute, quick answer to add a comment on everything that was said, if you don't mind. We have gone past our time, but we also started a few minutes after the time. So I think another 5 minutes, if you indulge me, would be okay. So please, any panelist who would like to add to these answers or add in any other respect, please go ahead. Alain?
Yes, I just wanted to answer a question that was asked about what would compel, let's say, companies that have approved, for instance, mRNA or other vaccines to share their technology. I think, I mean, to be realistic, if we think about, purely the commercial interest or the profits, if we accept the fact that these are profit-driven stakeholders, they're not going to go to to an African manufacturer, for instance, and kind of engage in a tech transfer. It has to come from governments. This is something that has to be subsidized, because for them the economic interest is not something that is obvious, and they'd rather, and we've seen that this has been a constant way of dealing with the increase of production capacity. They constantly went to contract manufacturers based in the global north. So for this to happen, we have, I think the African nations did and are still doing a lot to attract these manufacturers. And I think it's now also up to governments in wealthy countries, governments that actually funded some of the research that these vaccines are based on, to pressure companies to also share their technology with the hub, the WHO hub in South Africa, but there are other ways as well of doing tech transfer bilaterally, for instance, with some companies. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Dr. Edim, any last minute word from you? I don't see Michel. Perhaps he had to leave. Dr. Nikes, any word from you? Would you like to add something? If not, I think that the time has come for us to close the meeting. Not before, again, on behalf of Chatham House And allow me, Dr. Mandip, on behalf of UNDP, and this is the partnership, thanking you so very much for your participation, for your presentations, for your depth of analysis, for your policy analysis and recommendations. You know, work is being done. This is a very strong message that came. We are able to do it. Work is being done, but we need coherence. That is the other part of that message. There are on the table possible solutions, strategies, examples of what is being done already, including the use of technology and so on and so forth. So basically, it's to say thank you so very much for participating and helping us to launch this series of the partnership between Chatham House and UNDP. Please continue to be there, continue to be the voices of people who have opinions, you know, that are going to help policymakers, that are going to help Africans really to go beyond this big hurdle of the vaccine access and manufacturing in the quest for a good recovery in Africa post-COVID-19, and as we say, leaving no one behind. So thank you so very much. So I declare this meeting closed. Thank you very much again to everyone. Thank you.